In this final lecture video this week, I want to talk about a concept central, particularly to news media production. Now, you're going to listen to a whole podcast this week that discusses the news and this notion of objectivity. But I do want to discuss objectivity briefly here as both a key term and flag up some important and lasting issues that we'll continue to deal with in this class. Objectivity refers to the principle that someone can or should set aside their lived experiences, biases, and personal feelings to interpret, in our class, social phenomenon dispassionately and disconnectedly. And the question I want to ask in this video, and that they will discuss in the podcast if you haven't listened to it yet, is objectivity truly possible? And if you've listened to the podcast, I'm sure you can guess my answer here, but most social scientists and social researchers will tell you no. That because we bring our perspectives and lived experiences with us, and the effect they have in shaping how we interpret data, media, and everything we interact with and how we approach the world, it is impossible to be truly connected, to be truly disconnected and dispassionate about how we interact with and perceive the world. No matter how hard you try, you can never completely disconnect yourself from your experiences. They make up your personality, your worldview, and who you are. Nor can you take on the experiences of someone else. In these cases, empathy and understanding can only get us so far. I can listen to my friend tell me about their experiences skydiving, but it's not the same as having that experience and recalling it myself. I can also listen to my friend tell me about the dozens of times he's been needlessly and pointlessly pulled over by police, and I can listen with empathy and outrage, but I can't know what that experience is like from his perspective because I don't have those lived experiences and I don't hold the same identities that he does. And those different perspectives and experiences are important. Not only can we not separate ourselves from them, but we shouldn't want to. They make us who we are, and they are at the root of all types of human difference. We work with these experiences by acknowledging them and accepting them. So the next step in our social inquiry here is to question when objectivity is expected, or when it's called for and when it's not, particularly when we're thinking about covering news, media, and news stories. Often, objectivity is called for when the person covering or talking about a topic has a lot of personal experience with that topic. But is that really the best time to be concerned about that person's objectivity? White journalists, for example, rarely face criticism when covering issues of race for being too personal or not objective enough. Nor do men face similar criticism when covering issues like equal pay or abortion access. Nor do straight people when covering discrimination against queer people. And I would argue that's exactly the wrong way to think about and strive for anything approaching objectivity. Because whiteness and straightness are unmarked categories in our society, white straight people spend very little time actively thinking about our racial or sexual identities. I can speak from experience as a straight white person. So it logically follows that we aren't as well equipped to thoroughly think through any biases that we may hold related to those identities as white straight people. Whereas people whose identities are marked by society have to think about their positionality, their experiences, their perceptions, and identities far more often and far more consciously. So not only is objectivity not a reasonable or fair goal, but the pursuit of objectivity in practice ends up perpetuating inequality between people in dominant and marginalized identity groups. We often talk about objectivity as a nostalgic longing for a more objective era in news media, which is why I've pictured Walter Cronkite on this slide. He covered many of the major news stories of the mid-20th century. And your parents and grandparents may remember watching him. But the era of Walter Cronkite was also an era when news production and coverage was even more overwhelmingly dominated by middle or upper middle class cisgender white men who all had very similar lived experiences. Because of that domination, their views became the normative views of society, and their identities, as I've said, went unmarked. So when journalists with other lived experiences that were different from those of men like Walter Cronkite tried to challenge their view and their dominance, men like Walter Cronkite rejected these challenges by framing them as challenges to objectivity, rather than addressing them as what they really were, which was a legitimate challenge to the narrow representation of a very limited set of perspectives and worldviews shown on news media. socially and culturally, objectivity isn't really possible. And to be a good critical social theorist and media consumers, we should be wary of any calls for objectivity, especially if the people calling for objectivity aren't considering things like lived experience and inequality. Some of you may have read Howard Zinn's books in middle or high school, but I really liked this quote about objectivity from Howard Zinn. If you haven't yet, start exploring some of the course materials. The podcast from Queersplaining takes a deeper dive into issues of objectivity specifically, but you are now ready to take the lecture quiz, and I will see you all in class on Tuesday.